So, why do the opinions of professional critics often differ so much from the fans? Is it just the critics are out to get the fans, or is there something else at play? I want to examine that. Hey there, this is Perch. This was spawned from a recent article on Entertainment Weekly, dropped on November 23rd. 23rd, 21, November-ish, November 20th. There's the Hallmark Perch everybody knows. And of the best comic of the decade, the best comics of the decade. And we've seen lists like this before from Entertainment Weekly, from IGN used to do them. A lot of different outlets have put them out. BuzzFeed will put out, here's the comics you should be reading. And what's always puzzling to people who actually come in the shop, because people come in the shop and they'll talk about these articles, and usually the conversation goes something like this. They say, I can't believe that list didn't have blank, 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 blank. And they thought that blank was the best comic. That is and then no point. That comic's still on the shelf right over there. Nobody's even reading it. And there's some truth to that. So first of all, I want to say that this has been going on since, I remember lists like this in the 80s. And the lists, and as the years have gone on, the Eisner Awards, other things that have happened, reflect a different reality from the comic shop and from what the mass market of comic fans are reading. And the interesting dialogue goes, and I've tried to have this conversation very fairly, because this is one of those cases where if you go to one of the creators, particularly one of the creators who was nominated or who won or really wrapped up in this, they get very passionate about it, passionate to the point of being belligerent at times. And, they'll accuse you of being kind of anti-comic and other kind of silliness like that. But first off, I should just say, for an industry that is small, that relatively speaking, it's nowhere near the Hollywood entertainment industry. It's not near literature. It doesn't have the credibility of the New York Times list, even though some comics have been there. It's not considered a book. And so therefore, there aren't many award shows. There aren't many awards and lists given to comics at all. And so it's understandable that the creators would be somewhat protective of these lists, because this is their chance to shine. This is their chance to actually get some recognition in a world that gives recognition to all of the other creative fields. Some creators, bitter, they call them bitter. See, I've fallen in the same trap, who leave comics for other industries. Will say, I want to start working on something that was actually serious, that was actually people cared about, as opposed to comics. And it's a weird statement to make when comic books are making billion-dollar films and they're key to pop culture. Who would have thought? I guarantee you, nobody at Disney would have thought that the Marvel acquisition would have proved so much more successful in terms of revenue and just what it meant for their entertainment business than Star Wars. But it has. And you still see Disney recalibrating with what they're putting in the parks. And, if they could go back in time right now and do a Marvel land as opposed to the Star Wars Galaxy Edge land, guarantee you they would do it. But regardless of all that, this list talks about, the best comic of the decade. And the comic they pick is one that a lot of comics lists pick, and that's Saga. Saga is listed as the very best comic of the decade. Now, I like Saga. I think it's a good book. I've done a video on it in the past. I think that it tells a tight story. I think that it knows what it wants to do and it does it. And I think for those reasons, it is a good comic. And if you haven't read it yet, it's worth picking up. At the same time, it's not, it's a strong seller, but it's not the number one book that moves off the shelves. And even though it does do well in trade, and so I'm not throwing shade at it. It's just, how are you measuring the best comic of the decade? If you talk to fans, if you just do a poll of all the people coming into the comic shop week after week, Saga would be high on the list, but wouldn't be at the top of the list. One of the more mainstream books would. And and to some extent that's a shame, because I think Saga is better made than a lot of those mainstream books. And I think that it is, again, it may not be your cup of tea, it may not be a comic for you, but Brian K. Vaughan is just a solid storyteller, always has been, and does a good job. It is the book that, for where Image is concerned, is likely to kind of pick up the torch from The Walking Dead and keep moving with it for a while, at least in terms of things getting translated into movies. but it's odd to see it at the top of the list without some acknowledgement that it's maybe a critical darling, not necessarily the the not they should these lists always bug me because they seem like they're not giving some of the explanation as to how they got to this number one book. They'll say things like, series record breaking issues, and that it's got 54 issues left, and it's an amazing story, wide spanning, the new Star Wars. I think that that's all nice. It's hyperboil, but I go back to the original premise of which I did this video, which is critics will make picks of things they like. I mean, if I go down further on the list, you have Batman there. Okay, that Batman is absolutely. There's two books. In fact, in these lists, when they're credible, there's always one or two books that actually fit what the mainstream's buying. And in this case, it's Batman, and then it references House of X, Powers of X down below. Now, I'll get to that in a minute, but it's notable that this is the first publication to really acknowledge the fact that this is a tightly wound, really keyed in story. But I'll get to that in a second. Then it picks Black Hammer from Dark Horse. Again, a comic I enjoy quite a bit, but again, not one that's on everybody's lips. Day Tripper, which is very few people even know exists. Then it goes to the Quite Strange FF, the Matt Fraction version, where you had the Scott Lang led Fantastic Four team, which was oddly enough, you've got more OG She-Hulk. It's weird in Michael Allred's style. You've got a She-Hulk that is still dramatically better drawn than the current version. Anyway, and then you've got another Matt Fraction book. He's a critical darling as well, with Hawkeye. That book again, it's Hawkeye is a very interesting one because critically very successful. A lot of people note it as a really great story, tightly wound, really nice, but still, back issues don't, the trades don't fly off the shelves. I mean, there's demand for them, but not super demand. It's there, and it's interesting to see how it's been diminished over time with other writers who come in and kind of aped the style poorly. But anyway, and then we have Last Look by Pantheon, and Lumberjanes, which is another one that often comes up with Boom. Mr. Miracle, the limited series, Monstrous, which is Monstrous, is a great series as well by Image, worth taking a look. And then you got Miss Marvel by G. Willow Wilson, and my favorite thing is Monsters. So you have a handful of books here, Nemo, that are kind of again, they're critical darling books. The list caps off with the Kieran Gillian Young Avengers, and I want to say again, I keep saying it over and over. I've read all of these books. I think they're all good. I don't think any of these books are bad. I'm not going to come in here and trash them. I mean, the interesting part with Miss Marvel is they cite kind of how the character, really that first arc of how it was run, and there's a clue in there as well, by the way, of how critics get to it, by the fact that everything that the little brief blip on Miss Marvel talks about is really in reference to, say, the first 6 to 12 issues total. But two things to kind of follow up on. So first, I just want to, because I said it earlier, it's interesting to see how House of X, Powers of X is starting to hit the mainstream, where they talk about it kind of revitalizing Marvel's X line, and how social media is talking about it. And it's this almost it's acceptance, but it's this almost grudging acceptance over this book that a lot of people in the industry did not want to see succeed. And I long awaited video on that topic. But I mentioned that there's a clue in how critics arrive at these choices by the reference of Miss Marvel in a lot of these. And so the first and biggest one is, just like the Academy Awards, the publishers and the creators and people who kind of are involved in selecting these kinds of lists tend to send out promotional copies, the for your consideration copies, and they tend to send out contained arcs. You'll notice even in the article, almost everything references a trade or a complete story, not a comic. I mean, trades are comics, but you know what I mean. It's a collection, and there's comics that are solicited to people who do awards who don't necessarily read comics. And here's where I do not want to fall into the, oh, fake geek girl kind of thing. It's not like that. I mean, the people who I'm sure wrote this article have read comics in the past. I'm sure that they know their comics, and you can tell in the writing they know their comics. I'm not saying they don't. But what I am saying is that when people become critics and they say, here are the best comics, they're not reading all the comics. They're not going into the comic store like a lot of shop owners do and picking up 100 plus books and reading them every week. They're not doing that. They're selectively reading. And the more you select what you read or have it selected for you, the more, just like a window closes on what it is you're consuming, what it is you're bringing in. And so I think that the clue here in how a lot of these lists are done is the fact that the input is very selective. And when you start to input, like anyone, most people will read a certain genre of comics or a certain storyline. They won't kind of, read some horror and some romance and some action and some Kate books and some, this and that. They'll tend to start to gravitate to one particular book. Back in the 90s, Vertigo was something that a lot of critics gravitated to. And so you'd see these lists with multiple Vertigo books on the list. And then you'd go talk to the critics, the people doing the awards, and they would say, well, what did I read in a month? I read, and they would list off, 10 books. And of the 10 books, 8 of them are ones that are on their list. So they're self-selecting already what they're consuming, and that's going on the list. If I read 10 books and I said, okay, I need to pick from this list of 10 books, here's what I think the best are, I could do it and I could be passionate about it, but I wouldn't necessarily be representing the industry as a whole. And critics and reviewers, and this is true with movies and anything, because they have a lot of knowledge, a lot of education, a lot of history with comics or movies or whatever it may be, they're often looking for new and experimental things. They're looking for things that are going to buck the big marketing, the big effort, because they've seen it all before. And so that's why you get people saying, oh, this is an amazing movie, I really loved it. And the mass population says, I don't care, I'm going to see the $1 billion blockbuster over here because that's what I'm interested in. The more you consume, the more critical you tend to get. And so I think there's this, picture it like a hill where you're climbing the hill and you're reading a lot of comics and you're absorbing the history and you're seeing the big stories and you're selectively bringing things in, but you're consuming a lot. And then you reach the top of the hill where you kind of know what you like and you've seen enough things that you have a pretty good foundation of comics that you really love. You think to yourself, I'm not going to be surprised by anything in the past of being this amazing hidden gem of a book. And then you start the descent on the hill. And that's where you start reading less and less and less. And you start selecting into exactly what you like. And it's at that point in the career of somebody that they start making lists like this, or they start doing the awards. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting road that a lot of people take where these things are concerned. And I just urge people not to get too hung up on, why is this book on this list? Why is Lumberjanes on this list? For example, I don't like, nobody reads Lumberjanes. Well, yeah, if you go into a comic store, it's true. That's not a book that is flying off the shelves. Never has been. But there's still a good story in there. It still applies to someone. And if you're going in with your, $10, whatever it happens to be, $20, and you're walking out with 2, 3, 4 books that you are really excited to read and you're happy about, call it a day. I mean, who cares what other people read, right? You're getting your comics, you're happy. That's all that matters. And try not to fall into the trap that a lot of these sites and critics and award shows want you to fall into, which is assuming that their opinion is somehow better than yours. It's not. You know what you like. You know what is good for you. You should go toward that. A critic or a historian or somebody else, even if they have more education. I got into a fight on Twitter with Eric Larson about this. It doesn't really matter if they have all the history and all the education, all the rest. Their opinion of what the best comic is of the decade may have more information than yours because they've read more or seen more, but that still doesn't mean it replaces your opinion. Your opinion is your opinion. Your feelings on the matter count. They count the most because it's your money, it's your time, it's your comic. You know what the best comic of the decade is for you, and that's all that matters. People like me, people like critics, people like anyone who do reviews, those should just be data points to help you decide. Outside of that, hey, take it or leave it. That's what I think anyway. What do you think? Leave me a comment below. Sorry this got a little bit long. Would love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Do you often struggle with this critic versus fan kind of dynamic that goes on? Let me know. And follow me on Twitter, Comic Perch, like and subscribe and all those things. I try not to say during the videos, but every now and then I catch myself going and yeah, I just want to burn that from my vocabulary. Someday I'll just go through and start editing all those out of the videos. That's when everybody will know I have tons of time. I'll be retired. It'll be great. Thanks for listening.